Welcome back. For this video, I want to talk about the podcast that I gave you guys to listen to, I guess a couple of weeks ago now. I think it was back on week 7. I put it on Moodle. It just said like Shell Nigeria podcast. So hopefully you guys listened to that. And I just wanted to highlight what for me were some of the takeaways there and also talk about some of the ways that we might want to use that as a source for our essay or the ways that it might help us to think more deeply about the topic that we're writing about. So, just to remind you of what it was about, in that podcast, that they interviewed this woman whose husband was executed as part of the protest movement connected to Nigeria. We talked about Ken Saro-Wiwa, who was one of the leaders of this protest, who's mentioned in Independence Day. And this woman's husband, was one of these leaders as well, and was also executed. So we hear from her. So obviously it has the connection there with like the protesting stuff. If you're doing the protesting topic, you might want to mention some of that history as connecting to like the story showing us that protesting can be dangerous, but like ultimately it's worth it. And I think that aspect of it, like it ultimately kind of being worth it, it figures into this podcast as well. Even though this woman's husband was executed. Um, so some of the other things, it obviously shows us how bad the pollution is there. You know, there's quotes from in the podcast where they talk about the destruction of the environment, the death that it causes, and how it still causes like because of polluting water, polluting food and stuff, people to starve, to not have clean water, to get sick and everything like that. And that's a legacy that kind of continues. Like I don't probably even until now, right? Which that podcast is modern, so they're talking from today's perspective. So yeah, it definitely gives us a lot of information on how bad the pollution is. So again, maybe if you're doing protesting or maybe globalization, maybe that's some good background that you might want to include. Something that really stuck out to me was I feel like the court case that the podcast is kind of centered around. They interview the woman whose husband was executed, but the reason that podcast came out when it did, I think a couple of years ago, was because there was a court case against Shell, right? In our story, they talk about Summit Oil, which I'm honestly not sure if that's a real oil company or if they just like made up a name for the story. But in the 90s with the Ogoni people and everything, Ken Saro-Wiwa, Shell was the oil company involved. And the court case that they talk about in the podcast, it's a lawsuit saying that Shell basically conspired with the Nigerian government to, kill protesters, to put down resistance movements, the kind of you hear Kem Saro-Wiwa talk about his kind of peaceful approach to protesting and stuff. He says like we'll be peaceful and we will win and stuff like that. So again, if you're doing protesting, maybe that figures in about like the specific kind of protest that they try to do in the story, right? All that they do is it is like that peaceful kind of model, just marching and stuff. So we hear that from Ken Saro-Wiwa, and yeah, the main thing is the government conspiring like with Shell. So some of the things that they said, which apparently are from like internal documents that they recovered as part of this, was that Shell was involved in buying guns and trucks and ammunition for the army. And what if you look at it, they can say, "Oh, we were just helping out, or it was a gift or something." But you could also look at it and say, "Well, this is probably a bribe." And then they also said that Shell was involved in planning military missions. So here you have this private company that is based in the Netherlands, right? That's why they interview that reporter that has like the accent from the Netherlands. Um, and yeah, it's um, like basically controlling or having a big influence on the government of Nigeria, which is supposed to be an independent country, right? So it gets back to this question of independence and to something that in the other reading that I had given you for week 7, the other homework that I had given you, it was a speech by Ken Saro-Wiwa. It was a speech that he gave before being executed, which is pretty deep stuff, pretty pretty crazy, honestly, to read it. But one of the things he says there is that any country that can do to its own people what Nigeria has done to the Ogoni people, loses a claim to independence and to freedom from foreign interference. So that gets back to all the stuff we were talking about with globalization and the kind of idea of neo-colonialism, where these countries are, free politically, but they're still kind of being controlled economically in this way. In the story, we see it through the oil companies taking the natural resource, the oil, from the land and then making all the money out of it. But where does all the money go? It doesn't go back into the country. It doesn't go to help the people whose water's been polluted and everything. It goes to people who live in other countries, and shareholders and people on the stock market, and CEOs and this kind of stuff. So yeah, that was the big one to me. It was kind of shocking, honestly, to hear that like Shell's involved with actually planning these missions that then resulted in people's deaths. So yeah, just crazy stuff. But yeah, so if you're doing the protesting topic, if you're doing the globalization topic, again, all you need is one sentence to use something as a source. This can count as one of your outside sources. So if any of the background about how bad the pollution is, they give some statistics that, again, whenever we're trying to back up an argument, it's always good to be as specific as we can. So they give specifics about, like, I forget what it was. They say a certain number of homes that were destroyed, and like a certain number, the numbers of people killed or the numbers of people who lost their homes and had to move somewhere else. I forget the numbers, but it's like thousands and thousands, right? And then yeah, just the whole thing of like the kind of political execution of these guys, like because they led this protest movement, they were executed for it. So that's like the context that Madam Queen's protest takes place within. Everyone like Eve and her parents are automatically thinking about the Ogoni people when they hear like Madam Queen talking about protesting. So that shows again how dangerous it is. But then, okay, so I was saying that it kind of shows us it being successful to a certain extent here too, because they also mention that because of all of this, Shell did eventually have to abandon its oil wells in Nigeria, and that didn't get the land cleaned up. The land is still polluted and everything, but they did have to leave. Like they had to. Probably lose a lot of money, or at least they had to, they were forced to stop making whatever money they were making by pulling the oil out. So they did have to leave the region sometime in the 90s. So it's like they kind of had a limited success because Shell was forced to leave because of how bad its human rights violations and everything like they describe in the podcast were. They were forced to leave, but and the families of, or at least Ken Saro-Wiwa's family got a settlement payment of like $15 million or whatever it says, which doesn't seem like all that much money really. Um, so they had a certain amount of success. They didn't get nothing, but they didn't get the problem solved that they were trying to get solved, which was to get the land cleaned up, the water, everything like that, and have it kind of restored and have the bulk of that money go back into helping the people who live there. They didn't get that, but they did force Shell out. So they had kind of a limited success. So it kind of reminds me of the message in the story where it's like protesting is dangerous and hard, but it can kind of be worth it, but you might not get everything you want, where it's this sort of complicated middle ground. So I think we see the same thing kind of play out in the podcast with what really happened there. So yeah, again, could be an outside source, maybe changes the way we think about protesting or globalization if you're doing those topics. And yeah, those are my thoughts for that podcast. See you soon.